Good afternoon. On behalf of Thomson Reuters Institute, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar, College and University COVID-19 Vaccination Mandates, a discussion on ethics and legal nuance. I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers. Our panel will be moderated by Michael Ulrich, Assistant Professor of Health Law, Ethics, and Human Rights at the School of Public Health and School of Law at Boston University, Ray Flores, Principal of the Law Offices of Ray L. Flores II, Greg Glaser, Principal at the Office of Greg Glaser, Attorney at Law. L. Sid Johnson is Associate Professor and Ethics Consultant at the Center for Bioethics and Humanities at Upstate Medical University. Aaron Kheriaty is Director of the Medical Ethics Program and Professor of Psychiatry and Human Behavior at the University of California, Irvine School of Medicine. And Nathan Nobis is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Morehouse College. The panel invites questions from the audience. Questions can be submitted in the Q&A box in the lower left corner of your screen. Thank you for joining us. I'll now turn things over to Michael.
Thank you very much. So as Alex said, I am a professor at Boston University and very happy to be taking part in this panel discussion. So I'm briefly just going to lay out, basically the issues that we're going to deal with, and we're going to try to take both a legal and ethical approach with each of the discussion topics. So the main question is, we have seen a lot of universities, starting with Rutgers, passing mandates for their students, some just students, some students, faculty, and staff. And so there is variation in what the universities are doing, but obviously, regardless, there have been challenges to likely all of them. And so we're going to try to go through first what the general debates are, and then also each of us are going to take positions. And so I will, as moderator privilege, at times step in to sort of, push back on one side or the other if necessary. So with that being said, I'd like to open it up and start at least with just talking about the mandates themselves and what are first the legal issues surrounding these mandates. And so I wanted to invite Greg Glaser to go ahead and just sort of start off, and then others can fill in anything that they think is missing.
I would be happy to do that. Thank you, Michael. Boston University has really excelled in providing scholarship on this issue, and we're honored to have you as moderator. So the legal canvas here of vaccine mandates is that colleges are mandating COVID vaccination, which is by some doctors' opinions, an experimental genetic injection. Other doctors consider this to be a helpful vaccine that is going to end the pandemic. And so therein, we have a constitutional question, which is, can the vaccine be mandated? And colleges are going ahead and putting their foot forward and saying, we think that it can. And the question for lawyers today is, can the vaccine, based on any precedents, can the vaccine be limited to only those who want it? Or can colleges mandate it upon students who don't consent to the vaccine? And that analysis will bring us into a discussion of things like strict scrutiny, bodily integrity, and the 14th Amendment.
Great, thank you.
Can I ask when you call the vaccine? Can I ask when you call the vaccine experimental, or report that some think it's experimental? What do you mean by that?
Sure. Well, an experiment is one where the science has not been settled, where for example, the clinical trials were short-term, where the number of individuals used in the clinical trials to assess the safety of the vaccine and also the efficacy was not statistically significant enough to provide the kind of data necessary to give full FDA approval. And even if the FDA does approve a vaccine and it's approved for use in the general population, it still remains in what's called stage 4 of the process, where the FDA is engaged in post-market surveillance, and the manufacturer as well. And so the only way to truly know the safety and efficacy of a vaccine is to compare a genuine control group of someone who has not received the product. And that research has not been done. Many doctors are saying this is an experimental genetic injection.
This vaccine was tested with control groups. Most drugs that have been approved by the FDA are still under market surveillance. Those are just facts about the way that drugs undergo approval and clinical trials. There are ongoing clinical trials of this particular vaccine, it's true, including on different age groups. But the fact that it's under emergency use authorization does not mean that this vaccine was not very thoroughly tested and tested in large numbers of people around the world.
Yeah. Did people who say that vaccine just generally isn't effective? I mean, how does what they say jive with what seems to be sort of common observations? That it seems like the vaccine is pretty effective.
Well, I think the way to address the question is actually much more specific than just the word effective. I think what we have to do is get into the short-term efficacy data. For example, the efficacy of the Pfizer vaccine was assessed for approximately a 2-month observation period. And not all of the confidence intervals were sufficiently high enough to justify the claims made about the vaccination. For example, in these especially in these younger age groups like 16 to 17. And so a great resource to look at that data, all from official sources such as the FDA and the CDC, would be Physicians for Informed Consent. That has published vaccine information statements, vaccine risk statements about each of the vaccines. And I think it's a great debate for doctors to really get involved in and to talk about just how detailed were these short-term 2-month clinical trials. So obviously everyone would agree that we don't have long-term data on the COVID vaccine.
So one of the questions, though, is sort of this issue of emergency use authorization, which gets brought up a lot. And so while this is not the first time the EUA has been used, and in a recent district court opinion challenging or upholding Indiana University's mandate, the district court judge said that this actually was a more stringent version of EUA than in past circumstances. And so what then makes this more questionable, if at all, than past uses of EUA?
I'd like to start to address this topic. Indiana University has been appealed in the Seventh Circuit, and now it appears as though it's going directly to the Supreme Court. The judge in the appeal, in the decision, stated that just as a school can issue homework assignments, they can also mandate vaccines. And then in Houston, the judge, and that case hasn't gone to appeal yet, the district court judge said that the people who don't vaccinate are a danger to themselves. So obviously we're dealing with judges who are maybe not really ready to address the issues of what an emergency is and what the consequences should be. The way I look at it, we're also filed against de Blasio in New York over the PCR test. And the word consequence is the key issue, in my opinion, because consequences cannot mean that you're going to be kicked out of school or terminated from your employment. The word consequences should be that it's medical consequences. So there is an option to opt out of an EUA product as long as you understand what the consequences are, but the consequences are medical consequences, not being fired. And in Doe v. Rumsfeld, the consequences could have been solitary confinement or dishonorable discharge or demotion. And the judge in that case held that they could not, the Department of Defense could not mandate a vaccine that was not licensed. And there is a difference between licensure approval of being, quote unquote, reasonably safe and effective, versus an emergency medical countermeasure, which has not been proved to be safe and effective. And yet, even though this vaccine is still under an EUA and has not been determined to be safe and effective, the FDA has no problem advertising that it is safe and effective, when indeed it has never been duly determined that it is.
Can the other panelists hear me? I think I've been having some microphone difficulties. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I tried to make a couple of interventions, and I think they're not landing. So just on the question of whether it was experimental, we can at least say that it was experimental for certain important populations. For example, the original studies prior to EUA did not include pregnant women, did not include people who had recovered from COVID, which are estimated to be about a third of the general population. So there were large groups of people for whom the vaccine was being given the first time for the first time as it was being rolled out publicly. We really didn't know anything about how the vaccine would impact those folks or the risk-benefit ratio for those populations. So, so that's sort of one point in favor of the idea that we're still very early on in the process of gathering data on these vaccines. And actually, with each new week, we're learning more about the safety and efficacy of these vaccines and the risks and benefits for various populations. So just in the last few weeks, there have been several studies published, a couple of them by the CDC itself, which you can find in their weekly morbidity and mortality report, showing diminished efficacy against some of the new variants and increasing numbers of breakthrough cases in vaccinated individuals. So there still is a gap between vaccinated and unvaccinated in terms of the first infection or reinfection. That gap appears to be closing over time, suggesting that the efficacy of the vaccines may be wearing off after 6 to 8 months. Another study out of Israel, for example, showed that you're 2.5 times more likely to get a breakthrough infection if you were vaccinated in Israel in January. They were one of the first countries to roll out the vaccine, versus if you were vaccinated there in April, which suggests the possibility, and of course that needs to be replicated. It's just one early signal of this. But you put that in the context of these other studies, some of them in the United States, showing rising rates of breakthrough infections in those who are fully vaccinated. And the combination of either efficacy waning over time, which Pfizer itself acknowledged last week in its 6-month data, and possibly diminished efficacy against new variants. This is one sign that we know more now about these vaccines. We know more now about their safety and efficacy than we did when emergency use authorization was granted. And as people see these numbers changing, initially I was told when I got the vaccine that it was 95% effective. Now I'm reading in the New York Times that it may be less effective against Delta and even less effective against this Lambda variant overseas. People can begin to suspect that they weren't given all the information. And it's important to emphasize when there's things that we don't know, as part of the informed consent process, to be able to say, we really don't know. We don't know how long this immunity is going to last. We don't know what the long-term risks are, just like we don't know what the long-term risks of COVID are. And that's where I think the issue of informed consent becomes very important. One of my worries is that informed consent is being bypassed or set aside by these vaccine mandates.
Thank you, Sid.
Yeah, just to address a couple of those points. Obviously, we were not able to test the efficacy of the vaccine against variants of the virus that did not exist at the time that the vaccine was approved. Whether or not the efficacy of the vaccine will wane over time isn't really relevant here. There are lots of vaccines that are very effective, which require boosters throughout your life. If you haven't had the measles vaccine in the last 20 years, you probably should get a booster shot for that. It doesn't mean the vaccine doesn't work. It means that your immunity to a disease can wane over time, when you have been vaccinated. But this is true of many vaccines. It's really not relevant here in terms of whether or not the COVID vaccines are effective, because they've been shown to be very effective. Most of the people who are being infected now with the Delta variant are unvaccinated people. People who are vaccinated can get breakthrough infections. That happens with other vaccines as well. And they don't get as sick, and they don't end up in the hospital, and they don't end up dying. The point of the COVID vaccines was to stop people from getting really sick and being hospitalized and dying, and they've been extremely effective at doing that. The other point that you raise about whether or not it was tested on pregnant women, more than 90% of FDA-approved drugs and vaccines have never been tested in pregnant women. We do have a really serious problem in this country of not actually doing adequate clinical trials in pregnant women who have all kinds of medical needs, just like everyone else in the world. But the reasons for that are not because we just didn't feel like it. There are reasons that discourage clinical trials in pregnant women and concerns about risks to fetuses. But that does not mean that the vaccine won't work in pregnant women, and it doesn't mean that it won't be effective and safe in pregnant women. We just haven't tested it. But that's true of almost every approved drug in this country.
Yeah, the argument, though, is not about safety and efficacy. It's about information. So whether vaccines wearing off after 6 months is relevant or not is a question for patients. If we had informed the public that you may need a booster in 6 months, that may have changed the public's attitudes toward getting the vaccine. And again, going back to the central ethical principle of informed consent, if it's relevant to the patient, if it's relevant to the population in question, then it's relevant to physicians and to those who are proposing these public health mandates. And I'd also like to point out, because your argument elides an important gap. And this is how these arguments have gone in general, and it concerns me. What I mean by that is that there's a huge gulf between making a plausible public health argument that everyone should be vaccinated, which you can obviously make a plausible public health argument that everyone should be vaccinated. That argument is not difficult to make. But there's a big jump between making a plausible public health argument that everyone should be vaccinated and saying we can and should coercively mandate everyone to be vaccinated. I can make a plausible public health argument that we would save tens of thousands of lives every year if we lowered the speed limit on the freeway to 20 miles an hour. I know with certainty that we would save a certain number of lives of people who die in motor vehicle accidents, and I could make a public health argument that it would be worthwhile to do that. But whether or not the law should coercively mandate, so to speak, a change like that, with all kinds of other competing goods at stake and individual liberties at stake, it doesn't necessarily follow from the fact that we may save some lives to the fact that we can therefore force this upon people who may be hesitant or concerned or recalcitrant in some way.
So the discussion here was about efficacy of the vaccine, and I was responding to that. In terms of the issue of informed consent, I absolutely agree with you that informed consent should be informed. But if the standard for being informed is that a patient or an individual has to know absolutely everything that could possibly be known about a vaccine or a drug, including how long it might last, that's an impossible standard, and it's not a standard that we expect of anything else. It's not a standard that we expect for any other drug that someone might be prescribed. So
No, and that's not the standard that I'm proposing. The legal standard has evolved over time, and the ethical standard for physicians has evolved over time. Originally, the standard was, what would the average physician tell a patient? That was challenged in court, and several case law precedents nudged us toward, it's not about what the doctor wants to tell the patient, it's about what the patient wants to know. So then the standard became, what would the typical patient want to know about this intervention or that procedure? And that was further challenged, and further case law continued to refine the standard to an individualized patient standard, such that certain patients want to know less information, other patients want to know more information. Withholding information that may be relevant to a patient's decision for a patient who wants to know more is not acceptable. It's not an acceptable.
We're not talking about withholding information here. You're asking that patients have to be given information that doesn't exist. I mean, I'm not questioning at all what the standards for informed consent should be here. And I absolutely believe that informed consent should be as informed as we can make it, relevant to the needs and the desires, and including the need for information that patients might have. But that's not what this conversation has been about.
You're misrepresenting my point. I'm not asking for information that's not available. When information is not available, the appropriate answer to a patient's question.
You specifically mentioned that the efficacy of the vaccine might wane and that might change people's minds about whether or not they want the vaccine. You said that. I'm talking about what you've said here. And I mean, I can tell you it wouldn't change my mind if I had to get a booster for this vaccine in 6 months or a year. And I'm going to suspect that for very many people who were very eager to get the vaccine, it won't change their minds either. If it would change your mind, that's fine. But when that information doesn't exist or can't possibly exist, we can't expect that our informed consent documents have to include something like, well, we don't know how long the effects of this vaccine will last. People have to get a flu vaccine every single year. People have to give boosters of other vaccines periodically because the immunity will wane. But that does not change whether or not a vaccine is effective and whether it's safe. And those are things that people need to know when they consent to one.
It sounded to me like you were saying that. It sounds to me like if you were saying, if the typical patient asks, like, what are my chances with the vaccine versus what are my chances without it? It sounds like your answer is we have no idea. Is that what you're saying?
Not at all. Not at all. The answer is it depends on the patient. It depends on your particular age category. So the one-size-fits-all approach to vaccination doesn't take into account that a healthy 20-year-old has an entirely different set of risks vis-a-vis
Okay,
COVID.
so there is no typical patient. Fine. Switch the answer to...
I'm not trying to understand the question then. I'm a physician. I treat individual patients. And if individual patients ask me, what are my chances with the vaccine, the answer is going to depend on their risks of acquiring COVID, the risks of having a bad outcome if they get COVID, and what is known about the risks and benefits of the vaccine. So medicine is complicated in that way. And a homogenizing sort of public health approach that says, one size fits all for everyone doesn't take account of people's individual concerns and individual preferences is problematic from the standpoint of clinical ethics.
Let me just
perfectly legitimate questions about if I'm not really at risk of having a bad outcome from COVID, and there's not good evidence that this is going to reduce transmissibility, or I have natural immunity that is more robust than vaccine-mediated immunity. Why should I get a vaccine? And our only answer is, well, you have to because your employer or the state or some other agency that you work for or work under is requiring it. That's not a satisfying answer for many people, and that's why you're seeing backlash against this. That's why you're seeing pushback against this, because people are not getting perfectly reasonable questions answered.
Let me just add real quick here that the informed consent regulations for EUA is different than for approved licensed vaccines. So there are notices to caregivers that are given out, and the caregivers are the ones who are supposed to be informed by law and not necessarily the patient as much, since the emergency means that the procedure is streamlined.
And I'd like to step in here. We've talked a lot about informed consent, and so I want to make a few clarifying points that I think may be useful to the audience. At points we're talking about, can these mandates be done? And at points we're talking about, should these mandates be done? And both of these are important questions, but one is a legal question. Can these mandates be implemented? and one is a policy or ethical question. Should these be mandated? And I think the other thing that we need to be careful is there's a difference also between clinical ethics, right? What an individual physician has ethical responsibility to an individual patient versus public health ethics, right? What should policymakers be doing to protect the public health of a larger population? And so those don't answer necessarily all of the questions, but it is important, I think, to differentiate between both of these dichotomies. That being said, I also think we really want to focus on the college setting. That is what the title of the webinar is, and the mandates, right? So even if you say a mandate can be implemented and maybe should be implemented, you can still say, but here are the informed consent, here's the information that I think should be required, right? And that doesn't necessarily answer the question. That's just sort of here's how it needs to be done, right? And so things like that, if we're going to talk about exemption or informed consent, is what kind of exemptions, right, are there or should there be, and then what kind of procedures should be put in place. Most places, from what I understand, have religious exemptions, medical exemptions. And so since we've talked a lot about informed consent, I will give Ray or Greg a chance to talk about sort of the legal aspects of exemptions.
I'm going to open here first. First of all, I disagree with the premise that they should be mandated and they can lawfully be mandated. Just because preliminary injunctions have been denied does never mean that a court has upheld a university mandate. Second of all, with respect to exemptions, not only do states have different exemptions, but each college seems to have their own, everything from no exemption to medical only, which are next to impossible to get, to religious and even philosophical exemptions, such as in Indiana.
Thank you, Ray. And I will also add that the first thing is the emergency issue. You know, we have a vaccine, COVID vaccine, that is emergency use authorization under federal law. And when you read the FDA fact sheet for a COVID vaccine, it says right on there that you have the option to decline this vaccine. And if you do decline this vaccine, it will not change your standard health care. Well, the problem is that universities like the University of California are threatening students with disenrollment if they decline the vaccine. And you know what happens if you get disenrolled from the University of California? You can no longer access student health services. So you actually do lose your standard health care. And so right there, just from a procedural standpoint, there's an issue with colleges mandating vaccines. It appears to violate federal law. I haven't heard a judge go into detail or even discuss that specific issue of the loss of healthcare. So I think that's a procedural point that needs to be addressed right away. But the much bigger picture here is these mRNA vaccines like the Moderna and these adenovector virus vaccines, everyone acknowledges that these are genetic injections, that these are an mRNA alteration. And these are new. This is not like there's a long history of success with vaccines approved for use in humans. This is all new. So basically, what's happening is the public is being asked to trade their innate natural immunity for something that's about a year old and just kind of hoping that the corporate labs got it right. It's like, imagine you're a farmer and you just burn every heirloom seed that you have. And you just kind of hope that, that the genetically modified seeds are going to work. It's not a good strategy. It's not good science. In science, we should always have a control group. We should always be respecting the rights of individuals to remain in their natural state, because this allows us to compare the group that received the product to the group that didn't. And that's really the elephant in the room here that hasn't been discussed yet, is can we allow these individuals, this control group of unvaccinated individuals, to show the success of their approach? Because initial and early evidence is showing that natural immunity is robust. It is lifelong. For example, in the case of SARS-CoV-1, we're already at 17 years and running of successful natural immunity. And yet, the University of California is saying that they will deny a medical exemption for anyone who has natural immunity over 90 days, meaning you cannot assert your antibody test, you can't give them your T-cell test, you can't prove you have natural immunity for anything more than 90 days. They disrespect it. That's the problem, is the University of California is not respecting conventional consensus science, which is that natural immunity to SARS-CoV-1 and hence SARS-CoV-2 is robust. It's lifelong. It's durable. It works. And so it's time for courts to step in and recognize natural immunity. Why is natural immunity a fundamental right? The reason it's a fundamental right is because it's always been with us. Every minute of the day, we're exercising our natural immunity to billions of pathogens. When the founders of the Constitution approved the Constitution, they were exercising natural immunity in those moments. It's inherent. And so the problem with the current system is that the government is trying to force the University of California and many state employers and now private employers. They're trying to force this genetic injection on the people. And the courts should be stepping in and saying, you have a fundamental right to your natural medical condition, to your genetic status, like the Unruh Act in California. And therefore, because you have a fundamental right, we are going to only allow a very narrowly tailored law. And how did natural immunity get rejected from narrow tailoring? It's better than vaccination.
Sid, I want to give you a chance to respond.
Yeah. The original SARS virus and SARS-CoV-2 are different viruses. One of them had a very limited life of infectivity and then basically disappeared. Relatively speaking, people were infected with it. SARS-CoV-2, we've known for more than a year, people can be infected more than once. So this idea that there is this robust natural immunity that people who've been infected have is ridiculous. It's just not true. And we've known it's not true for more than a year. We've known it's not true since the early days of the pandemic when people were infected and then infected again. I'm not even going to get into these conspiracy theories about genetics and what mRNA vaccines do. These are not brand new things. These are things that have been studied for many, many, many years. So it's not like this is some brand new invention that just suddenly came up. We were able to harness that technology specifically for this pandemic because it already existed and was already available. And these stories about it changing people's DNA are ridiculous. They have absolutely no scientific basis.
And
well, I will say,
an objection to the reading of natural immunity. The evidence now is pretty overwhelming, and I don't want to get into tossing studies back and forth, but the number of reinfections are vanishingly small, as statistically close to zero as you can get in medicine and epidemiology. And the evidence for natural immunity to COVID does not rely just on COVID-1. We have plenty of evidence now, including studies, again, just published in the last few weeks, where we're seeing breakthrough infections in the vaccinated, infections in the unvaccinated, zero infections in those who were previously infected. This was a CDC study that just came out as a preprint. It's dated October 2021, but you can find it on the CDC's own website. So the evidence for natural immunity against this particular virus is very strong, and it's as solid as, statistically speaking, as evidence can get. Can you find a small handful of cases around the world of people who may have been reinfected? I suppose you can. There's always people that have immunological deficiencies that are going to be statistical outliers. But the idea that we need to vaccinate people that have already had COVID just does not stand up under scrutiny.
I'd like to address the whole idea of whether or not they can mandate and what emergency use authorization is. The masks, the PCR tests, and the experimental mRNA injections are all EUA products. And under 21 USC 360 BBB-3, they cannot be mandated. There must be an option to accept or refuse the injection. If any attorneys out there are looking to file a lawsuit against either their, have someone who wants to file against their employer or their university, contact me, Ray Flores, at Children's Health Defense, and I'll be happy to share templates, strategies, declarations from experts. And we're here to help because we believe that these mandates are unlawful, unethical, and they have no place in higher education. There's no reason to prove to your admissions officer how stupid you are to get into a university.
I would like to step in here and say I don't think that this is necessarily for advertising, and also that is your opinion. There are plenty of legal scholars who have written on the EUA and the interpretation of it and believe that it does not prevent mandates. So I don't think that we, should speak with definitive certainty, especially when courts haven't weighed in on the EUA in particular. And the Seventh Circuit has said, look, Jacobson, a case from 1905, is what, is the controlling case here. And part of the reason that the Seventh Circuit didn't interject and stop the mandate was under their interpretation of Jacobson. And they said until the Supreme Court says otherwise, that this is actually less of a mandate than was upheld in Jacobson. And also, I think it's important to clarify that students aren't being forced to do this, right? They don't have to be vaccinated. So there are penalties and consequences, which some people say that is what the EUA requires, right? But these students that are bringing these challenges are saying, well, I don't want to be I don't want the vaccine, but I also don't want to wear a mask. I also don't want to have to be socially distanced, right? And so they are challenging not just the mandate itself, but, penalties or consequences of them not upholding or not adhering to that mandate. So and this is, again, what came up in the district court's opinion in the Indiana University challenge was, look, these people aren't being forced. They still have options, right? And that means, in the court's opinion, right, that those are reasonable alternatives, right? They can be informed of what the risks and benefits are of getting the vaccine, what the risks and benefits are of not getting the vaccine, and then they can make their choice.
And nobody's required to go to college, and no one has a right to go to college. So if you don't like the rules that your college or your university set, then you're free to look for another place that suits your individualism, if you like. Your moral rights are not being violated when a college tells you to get vaccinated or go home. Colleges and universities have lots of rules that mandate and mandates that promote and enforce student safety. They prohibit hazing and binge drinking and drug use. They prohibit the use of extension cords in dorm rooms. They prohibit non-residents from entering dorm buildings. These are all justifiable. They're infringements of someone's freedoms if they want to do those things, but they protect others from being harmed by you. And this is one of the things that colleges have a responsibility to do, which is to protect their students. But no one's forced to go to any particular college, and you can find somewhere else to go if you don't like the one that you're in. There's no sense in which this is a mandate that students are forced to obey.
And it's not just protecting students. It would be, more importantly, protecting the older people, more vulnerable people around them, such as instructors and staff and other people.
And the community at large. I mean, there was a huge outbreak of COVID last fall at Oneonta, which is one of the state universities in New York. And, it was attributed to students going to bars and going to restaurants and going out into the community. It was an outbreak that spread beyond the university into the surrounding town. So we're not just protecting students from each other. We're also protecting the faculty and the staff, everyone who works at a university, which is very often many people in the local community around a university. And we're protecting the local community as well. I mean, vaccine mandates are not just about protecting you as an individual. They don't just protect the vaccinated. They protect other people as well, including people who are more vulnerable to infectious diseases, people with compromised immune systems, people who are too young to be vaccinated at this point. So, you know, these are mandates on individuals, but the purpose of them is not just to protect those individuals. It's to protect everyone.
But that's
if the vaccine works, then they don't need any more protection. So what's the problem? You know,
well,
if you want to get a vaccine, get it, and then you're protected if you believe it.
It's
That's
also
the
a
problem.
hypothetical benefit. The idea that the vaccines reduce transmissibility is still not proven. It's one of those unknowns. It may turn out to be true. Wouldn't surprise me at all if it turned out to be true. But we don't know that it's true because the only endpoint that was studied in the clinical trials for emergency use authorization was reduction of moderate symptoms and hospitalization. That was the endpoint that was studied and submitted. That was the reason the vaccines got EUA. In the submission, in the application from Pfizer and Moderna for the EUA, it was stated explicitly, we don't know because these studies were too small, whether or not the vaccines reduce transmissibility. They might not. So the idea that I'm protecting other people with these vaccines might be true. It certainly hasn't been established that it is true. That's one problem with this argument. The other problem in minimizing these penalties, I mean, I personally find it sort of shocking that, you know, someone would look at a senior in college who might have an academic or other scholarship to that school, and if they were to lose that, would not only have to get into another college at a point, you know, after which applications have been accepted. They may miss a year. They may lose a huge financial benefit of staying at an institution that is supporting them with a scholarship. The idea that we can trivialize that penalty, I find sort of shocking. But it's also worth pointing out that many of these university mandates, including at my own University of California, the mandates are not just for students. They're for anyone who sets foot on campus, really, any employee, any faculty member. So the idea that a tenured faculty member who is well established in his or her professional life, you know, gee, if he has concerns about getting the vaccine for one or another issue and can't get an exemption, the idea that they could just pick up and leave and, gosh, you don't really have a right to work here, I think trivializes the nature of these penalties. If you're talking about taking away someone's livelihood, if you're talking about taking away the possibility of someone completing their higher education, you're not talking about trivial penalties at all. This is about as coercive, you know, short of jailing someone, as social measures and legal measures can possibly be. And I think the average employee and the average student at the average university certainly sees it that way. There's probably many students that would rather spend a few months in jail than have to leave a university where all their friends are, where they have a financial aid package that's working for them.
I think that is such an important point, and thank you for raising that. I agree, and I think that the courts would also agree. For example, in University of California versus Bakke, the 1978 affirmative action case, the plaintiff was denied admission to the school on the basis of his skin color. And the court, the United States Supreme Court, did not say, oh, denial of admission, well, you're not forced. The thing is that once you have a constitutional violation, in this case, decisions based on skin color, in the Bakke case, in this vaccine case, it's decisions based on genetic status. Skin color, genetic status, they're quite similar. Skin color, medical condition, very similar. The court didn't say, the United States Supreme Court didn't say, well, this plaintiff Bakke, he doesn't have the right to sue because his only loss is just he doesn't get to go to the school. You know, these are it's the violation becomes all the more insidious, all the more pervasive, because it's a constitutional violation. To tell someone your mRNA is different than this other person, they produce a little bit more antibodies, even though you have better T cell immunity over time, and your antibodies plateau at just the right amount. We're going to discriminate on the basis of these things and say that you have no right because Jacobson, that this is just rationally related, we're just guessing. And that's a key thing from the University of California. I don't know if you guys read their policies, but it is startling how many this may be the thing, we're suggesting that they might have better immunity. Maybe there's a reinfection rate. And I would, the physician here on the call correctly highlighted that the reinfection rate for the naturally immune is astronomically low compared to the breakthrough case rate. And so the key thing here for those who would like to take the pro-vaccine position on this call, the pro-mandate position, you got to cite the data. You got to cite your numbers, because the public is not buying it. Sorry.
So, out of curiosity, vaccines, are they like a type of discrimination? Or is it the thought that the COVID vaccines are unproven, in your view? Is that what makes a difference here?
You know, it's a whole analysis. It's a holistic analysis. We're looking at everything from the short-term duration of the clinical trials, the lack of post-marketing surveillance. We're looking at the nature of the discrimination, how these vaccines are made. The mRNA is made differently than the adenovector virus vaccine, but they're both genetic injections. Nobody disputes that. Somebody said the word conspiracy theory earlier on the call. This is not disputed. It's surprising. It's kind of shocking to hear that. And I think that's the thing that's getting across, is that people are shocked to hear the pro-mandate position. You know, the public, where the public is, they recognize these are genetic interventions. It's a genetic medical intervention. People don't shy away from that. That's where the patents are, for example. These are genetic developments.
Yeah, I just want to say,
I guess I would encourage you to somehow dispute that. Or do you have a citation that would say otherwise? I don't understand.
Well, you didn't answer my question. My question was just, do you say the same things about other vaccines as they are comparably discriminatory? Or is there something special about this vaccine?
There's definitely something special about this vaccine, but the same analysis is going to apply to all of the vaccines, because what you have is a systemic failure to compare a vaccinated group to an entirely unvaccinated group. Without that basic control group data, you're just not going to, you're not going to make any traction with people who are aware of vaccine risk. Now, granted, you'll make a lot of traction with people who are unaware, just kind of going with the flow, not looking into the details. But once you start crunching the numbers and actually comparing vaccinated individuals to individuals who've never received a vaccination, you just can't look away from that data, because the unvaccinated, people who've never received a vaccination, according to 2 studies published in PubMed in 2020, these are the healthiest people. They're significantly healthier than the vaccinated. And so that's an example of where, when you look, and you can look at individual vaccines as well and see, is a DTaP, more invasive than an MMR? And so the key here is, and I want to come back to the law. The key is that to do science, we need a control group. I'm sorry, there's no other way to say that. There's no other alternative. I need a control group if I want to do science. And if I need a control group, you guys, you have to respect their right to exist. You cannot eradicate natural peoples. It's a strong argument, I know, and that might be hard to hear, but you got to hear it, okay? You cannot eradicate natural peoples. Now, if you want to make an argument for eradicating natural peoples, please do so explicitly and cite your data.
So, but I think this is a really important question, and I want to give this question its due, because to me, the strongest argument against the position that I've become convinced of is we already do this for other vaccines at colleges, and that, and so there's an analogy there. So I think it's important to drill down on that question. It's a really important question. We've sort of generally accepted that schools can require vaccination for other illnesses, for vaccines that have been around a lot longer and are well established and are usually required in most states in childhood. But when you look at that issue, I think there's a couple of distinctions that are helpful in thinking through how this case may be similar in some respects, but maybe different in other respects. So the diseases that we vaccinate children from, we have plausible reason to believe that if vaccination rates become too low, those children could be seriously harmed by those very illnesses. These are childhood illnesses that can have severe adverse effects on children. So the primary justification for those vaccines is the protection of the individual who's being vaccinated. There's a secondary happy effect that if we achieve herd immunity with vaccination, we might be able to protect, other individuals, older adults, other people who may be, not able to be vaccinated because of they're immunocompromised or whatever. And that's all to the good, but the primary justification is still, is still the protection of the child who's subjected to the risks of the intervention itself, subjected to the vaccine. The justification, that particular justification does not work for the COVID vaccines, or at least it's not clear that it works for the COVID vaccines. Yes, you can find counterexamples of 19-year-olds hospitalized in the ICU. And by the way, I've treated and evaluated as an ethics consultant hundreds now of patients in the ICU with COVID. I've had to tell many family members that their loved one was irretrievably dying of COVID. I've seen everything that this illness can do, right up close and personal. I've had the illness myself. My family's had the illness. So I do not want to trivialize the seriousness of this illness, but statistically speaking, it does not harm younger individuals. It does not harm adolescents. It does not harm young adults. If we saw those numbers with everyone, nobody would be talking about a vaccine because the harms are not zero, but again, just about as close to zero as you could get when you're talking about epidemiology. And so the only justification for vaccination is that it's going to potentially, we don't know for sure, but potentially help other people. But if that's your only justification, you don't have the primary justification of helping the individual, then you're instrumentalizing this population for the sake of a potential marginal benefit to another population. And when you instrumentalize a population for the benefit of another population, you start crossing some what I consider to be very foundational ethical lines. Whenever we bypass informed consent of competent adults, if you look at the history of medicine in the 20th century, whenever we in the United States have overridden the informed consent of competent adults, whether in the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, whether with eugenic sterilization of mentally incapacitated individuals, whether with the Guatemala syphilis experiments that that our public health establishment supported abroad, it was always justified in the name of some kind of utilitarian greater medical good for the population as a whole. And it was always done, to be honest, with benevolent and humanitarian motives. But even so, it never ended well. None of these adventures ended well. None of these projects are things today that we look back on and are proud of. And I think these are important cautionary tales because it's in times of crisis, it's during wars, it's during pandemics, it's when we're under pressure to get things done that we're I think, more sorely tempted to jettison some of our most basic ethical principles in the name of the greater good or in the name of winning the war. It's very interesting that the language used around COVID now so often deploys this military metaphor. And I think it's now during this time where we have to go back to the fundamentals of medical ethics, and arguably the most fundamental principle of modern medical ethics, from Nuremberg to the Helsinki Declaration to the Belmont Report in the United States, is the principle of informed consent.
I just want to say I would push back on the idea that forced sterilization was for benevolent purposes, though it was upheld in Buck v. Bell. And I don't know that this is comparable to things like Tuskegee either. And so I think we can disagree maybe over the process and maybe interpretations of the data, but I think that the fact that it's been these vaccines have been given over 160 million doses, right? You have millions and millions of people. You have even more worldwide. We have significant data on safety, right? And we have indication, right, through increased vaccination rates and decrease in infections that are suggestive, in addition to the previous data, that these are effective. And so this isn't necessarily a medical debate, right? I'm sorry. I mean, you know, we do have one position here, but I don't think any of us claim to be medical experts otherwise. And so we have a history in this country, though, of saying, yes, there are rights that you have both legally and ethically, but at times those can be infringed upon for the greater good, right? And I don't think, again, that forced sterilization qualifies under that categorization. So really then the question I think, you know, that's most urgent here are risks and benefits, right? So we've said there's really not much of a risk for young people to get infected and be seriously injured. Then what are the risks of doing it, right? Wouldn't the reverse of that be, well, also, we know vaccinations are incredibly safe. These technologies have been used for decades, even though these vaccines are relatively new, the technology to make them is not new. And so I think, isn't that really sort of another counterpoint? And again, you don't have to be vaccinated. You could apply for an exemption, and then really you're subjected to mask wearing, essentially. Looks like Ray has.
I would like to comment real quick that I disagree with practically everything you just said. The Buck v. Bell case was justified under Jacobson as well, and the DOJ Office of Legal Counsel memo that came out saying that EUA can be mandated, EUA vaccines can be mandated. That's the same Office of Legal Counsel that justified waterboarding. Lastly, the last thing I would like to make sure that I bring up is that there are no ways in court to go after vaccine manufacturers and make them a defendant. They do have the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Compensation Act. However, PrEP is the act that you have to go under. CSIP, you have to go under them in order to file against any vaccine manufacturers for a injury due to an emergency use authorization. And these are secret courts. It's a court of federal claims. There's no, under CSIP, there's no punitive damages. There's only medical expenses and lost wages. And there's also caps on routine vaccines. And most people are unaware that they don't really have recourse against these, so they can go off scot-free. Every one of these pharmaceutical companies has all had major felony charges brought up against them in the past. And all of a sudden, we're supposed to believe in these people who cannot be sued. This is their most profitable area of their business. And we need to be aware that why would anybody be forced to take something they have no way to return it?
I think we see this as people being forced to do things for the greater good, but you don't have to. I mean, you could begin with thinking that, well, we should respect other people. And since we should respect other people, my body might be a danger to you, and therefore, out of respect for you, I should do things of minimal risk to me to decrease your chances of risk. So, I mean, it doesn't have to be forcing people to do things. What we're advocating for is respecting other people and acting accordingly. Now, this analysis does depend upon an understanding of the facts. It's bad. That I can be a risk to other people, so on and so forth. But I mean, at least this is the mainstream kind of understanding of the facts. And the sort of flip side of seeking informed consent is respecting other people and respecting ourselves. And that's where you get the idea of, look, if you want to be part of this community, you're going to have to do some things to lessen your risk.
I can appreciate that, what you're highlighting, but many of those are empty words when it comes down to the rubber meeting the road. You know, you either push mandates or you respect individuals' rights to exist in a natural state. And what the data is showing us is that, my goodness, you guys, for example, the Delta variant, natural immunity is 700% better than the vaccine. The Israel Health Ministry, July 17, revealed that of more than 7,700 COVID cases reported since May, only 72 occurred in people who had previously had COVID, and that's if you trust the test. So that's at a rate of less than 1%. By contrast, you have 3,000 cases, or approximately 40%, occurred in people who had the COVID vaccine. So using your own argument, sir, you lose, because the unvaccinated are healthier than the vaccinated. And that's just COVID. That's just if I have a narrow view of COVID. That means I ignore everything else in the world, all the heart disease, all of the serious adverse events that come from the COVID vaccine, all of these issues. I have to just look at COVID. You lose on the narrow view, and on the larger view, you lose terribly. So again, you got to cite the data, sir.
All right, well, we are at an hour, so I'd like to thank all of the participants and the audience for watching. And yeah, we are wrapping up. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.